Excuse me.
Hi, Hillary.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tracy Rigdon, and this is the Contrast Project. I have with me today Shelton, one of Jacksonville's probably most recognized faces in writing journalism.
Sure.
Yeah, and you were with Folio for writing for Folio, the previous Folio,
Yeah.
Folio Weekly, for what, 23 years?
23 years. July 18th was 23 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you're going to continue writing for them.
Yes.
Ongoing with the new ownership.
Yes. 2.0 just launched about a month ago with our first issue. We're going monthly now as opposed to weekly. But yeah.
Good.
Onward and upward. I also do stuff for Void, stuff for the Times Union, done some stuff for pretty much everybody. Yeah.
Good. Well, we enjoy reading your stuff.
Thank you.
Always have.
Appreciate it.
So one of the topics I wanted to go over on the first segment here was the new mantra that you're hearing on TV a lot, coming from the Black Lives Matter groups.
Yeah.
All lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter.
Sure.
And of course, Black Lives Matter was born in like 2014 after Trayvon Martin's death.
Yes.
And almost immediately when they started, there was a reactionary statement made: all lives matter.
Yes.
And that in and of itself is basically false, coming from the people that started it.
Sure.
Tell me your thoughts on that all lives matter,
Well,
thing.
it kind of falls under the rubric of propaganda. Anytime you're dealing with a political cause, activism, whatever, word choice is important. Your slogans, your hashtags, your visual assets are very important. And a lot of times it tends to be a little clunky. For example, when they talk about defund the police, it's one of those things, people say defund the police, and everyone's like, oh, we shouldn't defund the police. And they say, well, we don't really mean defund, we mean reform. That's clunky phraseology there. That doesn't work quite as well. Black Lives Matter, I think, is one of the best political slogans, maybe the best political slogan of the 21st century. And as you noted, this kind of came to pass in the modern era because of the Trayvon Martin situation. Michael Brown over in Ferguson, the demonstrations in Ferguson were the first real example of this modern era of black protest movements. A lot of the techniques, the tactics, the use of social media, getting into roadways and things like that.
Right.
Of course, the subject of police brutality in general, particularly in the black community, is something that's kind of percolated, over the years. There have been little outbursts like Sean Bell in New York back in 2007, or Amadou Diallo in New York back in 1993, or Rodney King way back in, was it 91, 92?
Yeah.
And then you can take it from there all the way back to the days of the Watts riots back in 1965, Detroit 1967, the nationwide outbursts that happened after Martin Luther King was killed in April 1968.
Right.
So there have been, usually what happens with this, and with a lot of such movements, is there'll be a flashpoint, something happens, everyone gets out there and pushes at it, but then it kind of fades away as it sort of fades out as other issues come to the fore.
Right.
This year, I feel that now, number one, there maybe have been more incidents like this, certainly more on video.
Right.
And so there's managed to be momentum. Like the George Floyd situation was already popping off. People were already demonstrating because of that. And then the whole Breonna Taylor thing came back around. And then Elijah McClain over in Atlanta. And even some of the things that have happened even more recently.
Yeah.
So there has
Since then, yeah.
So it's sad that those things have happened. The silver lining is that those incidents have happened, they've been recorded, so the current protest movement's been allowed to keep going and sustain momentum. As we saw here in Jacksonville and in a lot of cities, the first month of the protests, everyone was waiting for those numbers to die down, waiting for the turnout to shrink, but it never quite shrank. I mean, by the time we were taking down the statues here in Jacksonville, we were at least a month into the George Floyd protest, maybe more like 6 weeks or so.
Right.
Yeah, those turnouts have been still at peak numbers.
Right, right. And when after the George Floyd murder, and Black Lives Matter it got another resurgence, you know, and of course there's been several other, like you say, since May the 25th.
Yeah.
And it came to North Florida in a big way. We saw a lot of the rallies and demonstrations downtown, by the courthouse, by the police memorial building, and then it moved another splinter group started out in Clay County.
Yes.
The Black Lives Matter Clay County. And they're not necessarily, you know, part of the national Black Lives Matter movement, the splinter group.
Yeah.
And of course they being in Clay County around Middleburg, Orange Park, and everything, they run into a lot of negative feedback, you know, from the residents out there.
Sure.
It's if you'll see, you know, the peaceful protesters on one side of the street, and right across the street will be the All Lives Matter groups, and the Blue Lives Matter, and in Middleburg in particular, and I know for a fact because I've seen it personally, a lot of Confederate flags flying over there on that side of the street, and yelling obscenities, and actually waving guns at people when they ride by in their trucks, you know. And so what do you think about this I mean, it's bound to happen in certain areas more than others. And like I say, Middleburg is definitely one of those places where, you know, it's a safety issue for the protesters.
Sure.
Even though the police are there and they're notified ahead of time.
Yeah.
You know.
That's not going to make them feel any safer.
No. And in the case of the Clay County group, there was initially, when they first started, it was predominantly, the group was led, they had white leadership in the group.
Yeah.
And as they started doing more and more vocal protests, where it was, you know, where it was starting to show up in the news and in local media, it was showing up with their cameras, and they got more and more and more people, and it seems as though one thing was left out of that was the safety issue for those people that are protesting.
Yeah.
You know, and in that area too, I think in talking with some of them, a lot of and we were talking earlier about Tanisha Crisp, and you spoke with her on the phone.
Yes.
And she was
lovely lady.
Yeah, she's great.
She's great. Yeah.
And she had mentioned, you know, that was one of her concerns, was the safety of you know, her black brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And that would, you could definitely see that in the groups that showed up in Clay County. There were more white protesters than there were black, because I think Tanisha, I think she was spot on when she said, we're not going out there when there's going to be those people with their guns and Confederate flags. You know, that's just asking for trouble. But there again, when you're doing a peaceful protest, sometimes, you know, trouble is going to, you know, sneak its way in there. Another splinter group that we were talking about in Clay County is the one that Tanisha's involved with.
Right.
The Black Lives Matter Alliance. And we'll be talking with her probably next week, I believe. She was available for this week, but couldn't make it today. So we spoke about her alliance group, and they're more along their you know, driving mission is more community based rather than just doing a lot of protests. Whereas the other group seems to pop up, you know, do pop-up protests every single weekend. You know, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, you know, the protest is essential, but with her group, what they want to do is get some more community involvement. They want to do a back to school drive and food drives and things like that for underserved neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
So what's your take on that side of it? Because she actually did tell me too that she didn't necessarily want to be associated with the, you know, the global or the national Black Lives Matter group, rather than doing it, you know, a different way. Her community, like I say, giving back to the community.
Well, I'd say, number one, she's certainly on the right track as far as going into the realm of community outreach, because we're articulating concerns, but then you want to provide solutions as well, and it also looks good in terms of PR.
Yeah.
With Black Lives Matter, it's kind of a decentralized movement, like in the sense of there's not. I would compare it to something like Occupy Wall Street. Right. Like Occupy Wall Street began as a flashpoint in New York City, Zuccotti Park, and thousands of folks out there participating, and that was building on protest movements going back to like the WTO meetings in Seattle back in '99, the 2000 Democratic Convention and whatnot. So with Occupy, they had that in New York, and then you'd have people from there take those it's everything from fonts, page layout designs, slogans, hashtags, and technical aspects as far as like the logistics of organizing mass protests, which can be a big deal.
It can.
Now the upside to decentralized movements is that they can be very fluid and they can spread out quickly, and it allows you to kind of each protest takes on sort of the characteristics of the individual city that it's in. As we've seen with the current Black Lives Matter protests, it's happening in dozens and dozens of cities all over the country and in some parts of the world. And so you've got, it's one thing to plan, in many ways they're all similar, but at the same time, if you're organizing something like that in New York City versus Chicago or Detroit or Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, you've got everything from, like the roadways, the way down, and most of them tend to be in downtown areas, the way downtown streets are organized, which streets are one-way, which streets are two-way, where are the roundabouts, what are the traffic patterns like, things like that. And up north, or even down places like Miami and Atlanta, you're going to have a more urban clientele, shall we say. Like we've had violence in all these cases, but when you're up in one of these larger protests, the larger they are, generally the safer you're going to be. Things like what we may see in some of the smaller towns down south and whatnot, like Clay County, for example, that's a situation where you're sending your protesters into a setting where they could be outnumbered. And likely will be, especially as the backlash comes about. And the nature of the backlash, the sloppiness of All Lives Matter and all that, there are going to be lunatics out there, potentially. So you want to always be mindful of your safety and the safety of yourself, the organizers, particularly the organizers who will be targeted. If you're holding the microphone, you're holding the megaphone, if you're the person holding the sign, if you're the person standing on the front line, you are more likely to be targeted for retaliation, or more likely to just be snatched off the street or arrested on some pretense. But the first step in addressing the safety of your people in a protest situation is understanding that there is no such thing as safety in that situation. We just buried John Lewis last week, and John Lewis, he came up from the Pettus Bridge situation in Selma, Alabama, going on to become the Freedom Riders, working with the Freedom Riders, and we saw with that not only was there no presumption of safety, they went into it assuming that danger was going to occur. They would take them through all kinds of training. They'd have them sit at lunch counters like, okay, we're going to pull your hair, we're going to smack you, we're going to say deliberately triggering things to you in order to get, like poke you, and then you push, and then they have their excuse to attack. And we've been lucky that there's really not been that much. There was in Jacksonville, there's some tear gas. There have been a few unfortunate things that happened, but we've had at least half a dozen people lose eyes to rubber bullets. We've had around the country. We've had people snatched up off the street, journalists arrested on the air. We've had people driving their cars into groups of protesters. We've had people shooting at protesters even. Thankfully, we haven't had anything like that down here in Northeast Florida and in the Southeast. And thankfully, overall across the country, it hasn't been as bad as it could potentially be.
Could be. In Clay County, for instance.
My biggest fear was that one of these mass protest would turn into a Las Vegas type situation.
Yeah.
And thankfully, no.
Or Portland.
Yeah.
Portland's a mess.
Mm-hmm.
In Clay County, they even, when they started to have, really vocal opposition, they started basically trying to keep the rallies as secret as they could. But that's next to impossible with a group,
Yeah.
that on their Facebook page is so large.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have left the group
Yeah.
and splintered off.
Sure.
But they were trying to keep the demonstrations secret.
Almost like a flash mob type.
Exactly. They would send out private messages to certain groups.
Yeah.
And then those certain groups would send out their messages to certain groups,
Yeah.
But there's going to be someone in there that's going to take screenshots.
Yes, always.
And they were doing it. There's a Middleburg Crime Watch
Yeah.
Facebook group, and somebody had done just that. Kept taking screenshots off of the Clay County
Of course.
and posting it on the Middleburg Crime Watch thing, so that everybody that's on the Middleburg Crime Watch thing, they knew when the protest was going to be. They knew all this, and they would show up with their Confederate flags and their Blue Lives Matter flags, and
That's always going to happen.
Yeah.
You're going to have people looking at it from the outside, and some of it is good. Sometimes you got people looking at it from outside, like, oh, I didn't know this was going. I was supported. I want to jump in on it. But you'll have people looking at it from the outside, taking that information, passing it along to others. Because they're not, the protest groups on their social media, they're not necessarily blocking institutions. They may block individual accounts from people that cause them problems. But then you have the issue of burner accounts. You have the issue of infiltrators, which was a big issue with Occupy Wall Street. You'll have things like, infiltrators or people coming in pretending to be part of the group, pretending to support it just to gather information, or just to wait until a tense moment in a protest situation, and then they do something. You've got all these people up in front protesting, and you've got all the cops like right on the other side, and then you might have some guy 50 feet back down the line just throw a rock, and then once you throw that rock, it just pops off. As soon as the first thing happens, all everyone's mind goes to a different place. The cops go into aggressive mode, the counter-protesters go into aggressive mode, the protesters get into a defensive mode, and then from there, that's when those things sort of function a little more logically. If you think of the idea that as much tactics, technique, philosophy, logistics goes into planning a protest movement of any type. And there are some commonalities, but then there are differences in regard to, depending on what the situation is, what the group is, what it is they're protesting, what their goals are. But the same amount of planning and foresight goes into concepts of infiltration, sublimation, disruption, discrediting, because if you see a protest on the news, everyone's walking along, everything's going fine. But if something violent happens, the violence becomes a headline.
It becomes a headline, and then all the other people that have a negative attitude about it when they're watching the news, that's their first response is like, look at what those protesters are doing again.
Exactly.
It's all negative.
It goes from it's the difference between saying thousands of people gathered today to protest this or that, to violence broke out at a protest that happened today.
The whole headline changed.
Violence, and it's said with an emphasis. Violence broke out.
Right. You got to get that clickbait in there. Well, listen, we could talk about this all day long, I suppose. But let's go ahead and move on, and we'll talk about what's going to be happening in the next segment when I get to have Tanisha to come out and talk.
All right.
And talk about what her group is doing, and we'll go from there.
All right.
Thanks for coming.
Always a pleasure.
Till next time.
Yes, sir.